The garage has a cot, Dad. It's warmer than most storage units, so don't act like I'm asking for something cruel. Vanessa said it standing in the doorway of what used to be my bedroom, one hand already resting on the frame like she was measuring it for new paint. Behind her, the dishwasher kept running in the kitchen, the same low mechanical hum it always made on the drying cycle, indifferent to the fact that the room around it had just gone still. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Craig, standing by the window with his phone in his hand, didn't even look up. My granddaughter Lily's cartoon kept playing faintly from the living room, cheerful and small and completely unaware. I looked at my daughter the way you look at a lock that used to open for you and suddenly doesn't, and I understood. Standing there in my socks on the hardwood I had refinished with my own hands 12 years ago, that I had become something you set outside because it no longer matched the room. An old spare key nobody remembers the door to anymore. Still sitting in the drawer because throwing it away feels wrong, but never once being used. Before I take you further into this, thank you for being here with me. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know where this story finds you tonight. A quick note before we begin. This story contains fictional elements shaped for reflection and entertainment. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental. But I promise you, every lesson inside it is real. My name is Walter Hale. I am 63 years old, and for 31 years I ran a small locksmith and security company out of a converted garage 2 blocks from where I'm standing right now. The same trade my father taught me, the same trade I taught 11 apprentices who now run their own shops across 3 states. I built the alarm system in this house myself in 2009. I still hold the monitoring account in my own name because when Vanessa and Craig moved in 4 years ago, nobody ever asked me to transfer it, and I never thought to bring it up. That detail will matter later. Tonight, it was the reason a squad car pulled into this driveway at 12 past midnight, lights sweeping silently across the closed garage door, while I stood inside in a flannel shirt with a leather ledger pressed against my chest, listening to my son-in-law's footsteps freeze on the concrete behind me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it started, 5 days before Vanessa stood in my doorway and told me where I'd be sleeping. I had given this family more than money, though the money was real enough. 3 years of mortgage payments after Eleanor died, and I signed the deed into the Hale Family Trust, so the house would never be touched by probate. 41,000 in emergency renovations when the foundation cracked in the back corner, and every lock, sensor, and camera on this property installed and maintained by my own 2 hands for free, because that's simply what I know how to do with mine. I don't say that to make myself sound like a saint. I say it because a man needs to understand the shape of what he gave before he can understand the shape of what was taken. Eleanor had been gone 3 years that October. Heart failure, sudden, on a Tuesday morning while she was watering the ferns on the back porch. I still hadn't moved back into the bedroom we'd shared for 30 years. I'd taken the smaller guest room down the hall instead, the one that faced the side yard instead of the garden, because I couldn't make myself sleep in a room that still smelled faintly like her lavender soap, no matter how many times it got aired out. Vanessa knew that. She knew exactly which room was mine, and exactly why I'd chosen it. That's part of why what she did next cut as deep as it did. She'd been talking for 2 months about turning that guest room into what she called a wellness studio, yoga mat, a diffuser, soft lighting for the videos she posted for her small but growing following of home organization enthusiasts. I hadn't taken it seriously. Vanessa had launched a dozen projects over the years that lasted exactly as long as her enthusiasm did, which was rarely longer than a season. I should have paid closer attention to the way Craig had started measuring the closet with a tape measure 2 weekends earlier, jotting numbers into his phone without explaining why. The morning it happened, I'd gone out to the garage before 6, the way I always did, to run a diagnostic check on the alarm panel, an old habit from the trade that Eleanor used to tease me about relentlessly. "Walter," she'd say, standing in the kitchen doorway in her robe, "the house isn't going anywhere. Come eat your eggs." I still heard her voice sometimes when I did that check, and I let myself hear it, because some habits are really just a way of visiting somebody, When I came back inside, my suitcase was already sitting by the front door. Not packed by me, packed by someone else, my shirts folded in a way I never folded them, my shaving kit zipped into a side pocket I never used for it. "Vanessa," I said, "what is this?" She came down the hallway, already dressed for the day, phone in hand the way it always seemed to be lately, filming something or scrolling through something, I could never quite tell which. "We talked about this," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We didn't talk about anything. You mentioned an idea once, in July." "I mentioned it more than once, Dad." Her voice had that particular brightness people use when they want an unpleasant thing to sound reasonable. "The studio needs the north-facing light, and your room has the best light on this floor. It's just logistics." Craig appeared behind her then, wearing the kind of pressed casual clothes he wore even when he had nowhere to be. A habit of a man who dresses for a job he doesn't currently have, rather than the life he's actually living. He'd been between real estate deals for 4 months, though you'd never know it from the confidence in his shoulders. "It's just the garage for now," he said, like he was doing me a favor by clarifying. "Ray Delgado's old cot is still back there from when he helped with the foundation work. It's warmer out there than people think." I looked at the suitcase. I looked at my daughter. Something moved through me that wasn't quite anger. It was older than anger, the way a scar is older than the wound that made it. I thought of the ledger sitting in the garage cabinet where I kept it, the leather one with every master key code for this house recorded in my own handwriting, since the day I built the security system, and the small taped compartment in the back cover that held something I hadn't opened in 3 years because I hadn't needed to. I thought of the trust documents sitting in Gordon Pierce's office downtown, revised 8 months earlier, quietly, without ceremony, the way I did most important things. "All right," I said. Vanessa blinked, like she'd expected more resistance and didn't quite know what to do with its absence. "All right, all right," I said again. I picked up the suitcase. It was lighter than I expected, and heavier than I wanted to admit, the particular weight of a bag someone else has packed for you, deciding for you what you'll need and what you won't. I carried it down the hall, past the family photographs on the wall. Vanessa's wedding, Lily's first birthday, a picture of Eleanor and me on the porch the summer before she died, my arm around her, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. I stopped in front of that one for exactly 3 seconds. Then I kept walking. I want to tell you honestly, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer you in this story, that my hands were shaking slightly when I reached the garage door. Not from fear, from something that lives in the body sometimes and refuses to be reasoned with, a tremor that had started 6 months after Eleanor passed and came back at odd moments, usually late at night, usually when the house got quiet enough for the absence of her to fill every corner of it. I sat down hard on the edge of the cot Ray Delgado had left behind 2 years ago, and for a long moment I simply held my own hands together in my lap until they settled, the way you'd calm a spooked animal, patient and wordless. I want you to see that moment before you see anything else about me. Before the ledger, before the trust, before whatever you think this story is going to become. I want you to see a 63-year-old man sitting on a borrowed cot in his own garage, hands shaking, grieving a wife 3 years gone, and a daughter he could no longer recognize. Because a man does not become strong by skipping the part where he is weak. He becomes strong by sitting through it and standing back up anyway. It took me 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, the one I had installed myself, its second-hand ticking with the small, precise confidence of a well-made mechanism. When my hands were steady, I opened the cabinet behind the workbench and took out the ledger. I hadn't touched the back compartment in 3 years. I didn't open it that morning either. I simply held the ledger in both hands and let myself remember why I'd built the compartment in the first place. Back when Eleanor was still alive and healthy and sitting across from me at this very workbench, teasing me for being, in her words, the only man in Colorado who plans for disasters that haven't happened yet. I'd told her that was exactly the job. You don't wait for the door to be kicked in to figure out how the lock should have worked. I took out my phone. I had one name saved under a single letter, G, for Gordon Pierce. the attorney who had handled every piece of the Hale family's legal affairs for 26 years, since before Vanessa was born. I pressed call. It rang twice. Walter. Gordon's voice was steady, unhurried, the voice of a man who had been half expecting this call for exactly as long as I had been half dreading it. "Gordon," I said, "it's time." There was a pause on his end, not confusion, just the brief silence of a man confirming something with himself before he commits to it out loud. "You're certain?" I looked around the garage, at the cot, at the cold concrete floor, at the closed door that led back into a house I had built a life inside of, a house that no longer had a room in it for me. "I've been certain for 8 months," I said. "I just hoped I'd never have to prove it." "All right," Gordon said, and I heard the particular shift in his voice that meant he had already picked up a pen. "Walk me through what happened this morning. Everything. Don't leave anything out, not even the parts that feel small." I told him. The suitcase packed by someone else's hands, the word logistics, the cot with Ray Delgado's name still attached to it in my memory. I told him about the guest room, about Eleanor's lavender soap that had finally faded from the sheets sometime last spring, about the fact that Vanessa had chosen, of every room in this house, the one where I had gone to grieve quietly without disturbing anyone. Gordon listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Walter," he said, "I want to be clear about something before we go any further. What you set up 8 months ago, the trust revision, the occupancy terms, all of it, that gives you real authority here. But authority isn't the same as certainty about how this ends. Are you prepared for what happens if Vanessa doesn't come back from this the way you're hoping she will?" I thought about my granddaughter's cartoon still playing faintly through the wall an hour ago. I thought about the small, stubborn kindness Vanessa had shown as a child, the way she used to leave her allowance folded into an envelope on my workbench when she thought I was having a hard month, before Craig, before the version of adulthood that had somehow taught her that love could be measured in square footage and north-facing light. "I'm prepared for whatever's true," I said. "I just want to know what's true." "Then let's find out," Gordon said. "I'll have the occupancy notice drafted by this afternoon. 72 hours, formal, delivered to the property. And Walter, the monitoring account on the security system, it's still under your name, correct?" "Never transferred?" "Never transferred," I said. "Vanessa never asked, and I never brought it up." Something in Gordon's voice sharpened slightly, the sound of a man recognizing a piece on the board he hadn't fully accounted for. "That's going to matter more than you think," he said. "Don't touch it. Don't mention it to anyone in that house. Just leave it exactly as it is." I didn't know yet exactly what he meant by that, not fully. Not the way I would understand it 11 days later at 12 minutes past midnight, with red and blue light, sweeping silently across the closed garage door. But I trusted Gordon Pierce the way I trusted very few people left in my life, and so I said only, "All right." "One more thing," Gordon said, and his voice gained a gentleness that caught me slightly off guard, coming from a man who spent most of his working hours being deliberately unsentimental. "Are you all right, Walter?" "Really?" I looked down at the ledger in my lap, at the worn brass corner guard on its cover, at the small taped compartment on the inside back that I still hadn't opened. I thought of Eleanor's voice in the kitchen doorway. "Come eat your eggs, Walter. The house isn't going anywhere, except it had gone somewhere. It had gone somewhere without me in it." "I will be," I said, and for the first time that morning, I believed it might actually be true. "Send the notice, Gordon. Let's begin." I ended the call and sat alone in the quiet of the garage for a long moment, the cold concrete floor beneath the cot, the ledger heavy and warm from my own hands. Somewhere on the other side of that door, my daughter was probably already measuring the guest room for paint swatches, humming to herself, certain that the hardest part of this morning was already behind her. She had no idea it hadn't even started yet. The occupancy notice arrived on a Thursday afternoon, hand-delivered by a courier from Gordon's office. A plain manila envelope that Vanessa found propped against the front door when she came back from dropping Lily at gymnastics. I watched from the garage window as she read it standing on the porch, her posture changing by degrees, the way a tree changes before a storm actually arrives. Small at first, Then all at once, she came into the garage without knocking, which she had never once done in 4 years of living in this house. The envelope was still in her hand, slightly crumpled now from her grip. "What is this?" she said. Not a question. A demand dressed up as one. I was at the workbench, running a routine check on a customer's deadbolt I'd promised to have ready by the weekend. An old habit I still kept up on a small scale, even in retirement. More for my hands than for the money. I set the screwdriver down before I answered her because some conversations deserve your full hands and your full attention. "It's a notice, Vanessa. 72 hours to review the terms of occupancy on this property. This is our house." "It's the trust's house," I said, as gently as I could manage while still being entirely truthful. "You and Craig live here under an arrangement I set up when your mother and I put the deed into the family trust 9 years ago. That arrangement can be reviewed. I'm reviewing it." Something flickered across her face, and for one brief moment I saw not my 38-year-old daughter standing rigid in a garage doorway, but the 11-year-old girl who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on long drives, utterly certain that nothing in the world could touch her as long as I was the one behind the wheel. Then the moment passed, the way morning fog burns off a windshield, and she was 38 again, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You're doing this because of the room," she said. "I'm doing this because I gave a suitcase somebody else packed for me, and I ended up on a cot in my own garage before I'd even finished my coffee," I said. My voice didn't rise. "I want you to understand that. I have spent 30 years learning that raising your voice is usually just a way of admitting you've run out of better tools. That's not about a room, Vanessa. That's about what a room has come to represent in this house." She didn't have an answer for that. She turned and left, the envelope still crumpled in her fist, and I went back to the deadbolt, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. Though the ache behind my sternum stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon, the particular ache of loving someone and disappointing yourself at the exact same moment, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything you'd actually done wrong. 2 days later, the contractor showed up. Craig had hired a small renovation crew to start tearing out the closet in what used to be my bedroom, laying the groundwork for Vanessa's studio before the 72 hours had even fully elapsed, which told me something about how seriously either of them had taken the notice. I was in the garage when I heard the truck idle in the driveway, followed by voices, followed by a longer silence than seemed necessary for simple materials drop-off. Ray Delgado, my old apprentice and the closest thing I had left to a business partner, had stopped by that morning to return a set of pin tumblers he'd borrowed for a job, and he was the one who told me what happened. Standing in the driveway with his hands in his coat pockets and an expression somewhere between amusement and concern. "Contractor's card got declined," Ray said. "Twice. Craig had to call it in from his cell. I hadn't ordered that. I want to be honest with you about that, because honesty is the whole point of anything I'm telling you. Gordon Pierce had begun the formal financial review that the trust document authorized the same afternoon the notice was delivered, flagging every account tied to household expenses for verification before continued disbursement. Standard procedure, nothing dramatic, nothing punitive in its design. I hadn't asked for the contractor's payment to fail. It had simply been one of a dozen small mechanisms in motion, the trust doing exactly what a trust is built to do when its terms come under formal review, no more sinister than a thermostat clicking off when a room reaches the temperature it was set to reach. "How'd Craig handle it?" I asked. "Badly," Ray said, not unkindly. "Told the crew there was a banking error. Paid the difference out of his own account to keep them working." He studied my face for a moment. "You doing all right in there, Walter?" "Ambrose said you've been on that cot a week now." I told him I was fine, which was only partly true, and he let it go the way old friends do, not because they believe you, but because they know pushing won't get you any closer to the truth than waiting will. Before he left, he handed me a thermos of coffee from his truck, the same brand Eleanor used to buy, and told me to call him if I needed anything moved, fixed, or looked at day or night. I stood in the driveway and watched his truck pull away and felt, for the first time in 11 days, something other than grief sitting in my chest, something closer to gratitude, though it took me a while to name it, that Lily found me that same evening. She was 8 years old, all elbows and stubbornness, with her mother's quick eyes and, I like to think, a good deal of her grandmother's patience, though it was too early to know for certain which parts of Eleanor had made it down through the generations. She came into the garage in her socks, holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear, and climbed up onto the workbench stool across from me, without asking permission, which was very much her way. "Mom says you're sleeping out here now," she said. "For a little while," I said. "Is it because of the studio?" Something like that. She considered this with the enormous seriousness that only children bring to questions adults have long since learned to avoid. "Doesn't the garage have monsters?" she asked. "Craig says garages have spiders and mice and sometimes raccoons get in through the vent." "No monsters," I said. "Just an old cot and some tools and your grandfather, who spent more nights than you'd believe in rooms a lot less comfortable than this one." "That's sad," Lily said, with the flat honesty of a child who hasn't yet learned to soften a true thing for the sake of politeness. "You built this whole house's locks. Mom told me that. She said you built the alarm and the cameras and everything, and now you're sleeping where the lawnmower goes." I didn't have a clean answer for that. I still don't, if I'm honest with you now. I told her that sometimes the people who build the doors aren't always the ones who get to choose which side of them they end up standing on, and that this wasn't her fault, and that it wasn't something she needed to carry. She thought about that for a long moment, chewing on the rabbit's ear, and then she said something that has stayed lodged in my chest ever since, sharper than anything an adult had said to me in 11 days. "If you built the locks," she said, "why doesn't the house remember you?" I didn't answer her right away. I couldn't. I sat on that workbench stool with my granddaughter's rabbit-eared question hanging in the cold garage air, and something in my chest cracked open in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the particular grief of realizing that an 8-year-old had understood, more clearly than either of her parents currently could, exactly what had gone wrong in this house. "I don't know, sweetheart," I finally said. "I'm trying to find out." She hugged me before she left, quick and unceremonious the way children hug. Already halfway to the door by the time her arms had fully released, and I sat alone afterward for a long while, with my coffee going cold in Ray Delgado's thermos, turning her question over and over, unable to set it down. It was 2 days after that when Vanessa found the recipe box. I hadn't planned for it to happen that way. I want to be clear about that. I had simply asked, through Gordon, for a single formal accommodation during the 72-hour review period, that nothing of Eleanor's still stored in the guest room closet be discarded or donated without my presence, a small, specific request buried inside a much larger document. Vanessa, going through the closet to make room for yoga mats and diffusers, had come across a tin recipe box that had belonged to my wife, hand-labeled index cards in Eleanor's looping handwriting, half of them stained with 30 years of flour and butter, and the particular evidence of a life spent feeding people she loved. She brought it out to the garage herself, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened that week. She stood in the doorway holding it against her stomach with both arms, and I could see, even from across the garage, that her eyes were red. "I found this in the closet," she said. Her voice had lost its edge entirely. "The peach cobbler card is in here. The one she used to make every 4th of July. "I know," I said. "I gave her that tin the Christmas before Lily was born." Vanessa crossed the garage and sat down on an overturned crate near the workbench, the recipe box still in her lap, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Then, without any warning at all, she leaned forward and put her arms around me the way she used to, when she was small, before Craig, before the years that had somehow turned love into something measured in square footage. "I don't know what's happening to me, Dad," she said into my shoulder, her voice cracking. "I don't know when I started thinking this was normal. I held her the way I used to when she was 11, and afraid of thunderstorms, one hand steady against her back. And for exactly 40 seconds I let myself believe that this was the moment everything turned around, that my daughter had found her way back to herself, through a tin box of handwritten recipes and the ghost of a peach cobbler she hadn't tasted in 3 years. Then Craig's voice came from the doorway. Vanessa, the contractor needs you to approve the tile. She pulled back from me quickly, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and something closed behind her eyes the way a shop shutter comes down at closing time, fast and final. I have to go, she said, and she was gone before I could say anything else. The recipe box still clutched against her chest, carried back into a house that no longer had room for the woman who used to leave allowance envelopes on my workbench. I sat alone in the garage for a long time after that, turning over what I had just witnessed. My daughter was still in there somewhere, buried under 4 years of a marriage that had slowly taught her to measure worth in renovations and followers and north-facing light. I didn't yet understand how deep that burial went, or how much of it Craig himself had engineered. That understanding was still 11 days away from me, though I would begin to glimpse the outline of it much sooner than that. It happened the following Tuesday, almost by accident. I was in the garage late in the evening, running the weekly diagnostic on the security panel out of old habit, when I heard Craig's voice through the thin wall that separated the garage from the side patio, low and businesslike in a way that didn't match the hour. No, the Hale property specifically, he was saying. Corner lot, quarter acre, that whole block is zoned for the multi-unit conversion the city approved last spring. I know the current occupancy situation is complicated, but that's exactly why the timing works in our favor. If the old man's out of the picture legally within the next few months, my wife inherits clean, and then it's just a matter of getting her to sign the listing agreement before she has time to get sentimental about it. I stood very still on the other side of that wall, a socket wrench frozen halfway to the panel in my hand, and felt the floor of my understanding shift beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with the 72-hour notice or the contractor's declined card or any of the small mechanisms Gordon and I had already set in motion. Craig wasn't simply defending his wife's inheritance. Craig was planning to sell this house, my house, Eleanor's house, out from under both of us, and he was doing it in language that made my own daughter sound like an asset to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I didn't move. I didn't confront him, not that night. I stood in the cold garage with the wrench still in my hand and let the full shape of what I'd just heard settle into me, and somewhere underneath the anger, underneath the particular betrayal of hearing your own son-in-law discuss your death as a matter of favorable timing, I felt something that surprised me. A flicker of grief on Vanessa's behalf, because whatever she had become, whatever version of my daughter had learned to measure a bedroom's worth in north-facing light, she did not know this. I was certain of that, standing there in the dark. She did not know her own husband was already planning what to do with her inheritance before either of us was even gone. My phone buzzed in my pocket an hour later. Marcus, my son, and I hadn't spoken in nearly 6 weeks, not out of any real conflict between us, but because Marcus had moved to Chicago 3 years ago to escape what he called, not unkindly, the gravitational pull of Vanessa's opinions. And phone calls between us had grown sparse the way they do between people who love each other, but have simply run out of shared daily texture to talk about. "Dad," he said when I picked up, "Ray called me. Said you're sleeping in the garage." I told him the truth, all of it, the suitcase, the 72-hour notice, the declined contractor card, Lily's question about the house not remembering me, the recipe box, the 40 seconds when I thought Vanessa had found her way back. I did not tell him about the phone call I'd overheard through the garage wall an hour earlier. Some things needed to be verified before they could be spoken aloud, even to my own son. Marcus was quiet for a long moment when I finished. "I should have come back sooner," he finally said. "I knew things were getting bad over there. I just didn't want to be the brother who shows up only to say I told you so." "You're not that," I said. "You never were. I'm coming out," he said. And there was a steadiness in his voice that reminded me, briefly and sharply, of Eleanor. "Not next month, Dad, this week. Whatever's happening in that house, you shouldn't be sitting through it alone on a cot in a garage." I didn't argue with him. I found, sitting there in the cold with the wrench still resting on the workbench where I'd finally set it down, that I didn't want to argue with him. For 11 days I had been managing this alone, methodically, the way I managed everything, one careful mechanism at a time. But a lock, I have always believed, is only as good as the hand that built it, and a family is much the same. It needs more than one hand to hold. Come, I said. There's a great deal you need to see before this is over. I hung up the phone and sat for a long while in the quiet of the garage, the ledger still in its cabinet, the security panel humming its steady green light on the wall above the workbench, and somewhere on the other side of the house, through walls I had built and wired and locked with my own hands, my daughter was approving tile samples for a room that used to hold my grief and now would hold nothing but the appearance of someone else's peace. I didn't yet know that in 9 days, at 12 minutes past midnight, that same security panel would be the thing that finally tore the whole arrangement open. I only knew, sitting there with Marcus's promise still warm in my ear, that something in the shape of this story had just changed, and that I was no longer the only one standing guard over it. Marcus arrived on a Friday evening, driving straight from the airport in a rental car, and the sight of him standing in the driveway, with a single duffel bag over his shoulder, did something to my chest that I hadn't expected. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him in person, a little more weathered around the eyes, but he still had his mother's way of walking into a room like he was bracing to fix something before he'd even said hello. He didn't go into the house first. He came straight to the garage. "Jesus, Dad," he said. Standing in the doorway and taking in the cot, the space heater Ray had dropped off, the workbench I'd been using as a nightstand for 11 days. "This is really happening. It's really happening," I said. He sat down across from me on the overturned crate that had become, in the past week, something like a second chair in this makeshift room, and I told him everything, start to finish, the way I'd told Gordon, the way I'd told him partially over the phone, but never with the full weight of detail I gave him now. The suitcase packed by hands that weren't mine, the 72-hour notice, the contractor's card, Lily's question about the house not remembering me, the 40 seconds with the recipe box. And then, because he was here now, because some things are too heavy to carry alone, even when you've spent a lifetime believing otherwise, I told him about the conversation I'd overheard through the garage wall, Craig's voice, low and businesslike, discussing my death as a matter of favorable timing. Marcus went very quiet. I watched something harden in his face, the particular stillness of a man absorbing something he can't yet fully process, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful in a way I recognized from his mother. He said, "If you were out of the picture legally," Marcus repeated. "Not if you passed away. Legally." "That's what I heard, Dad." Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's not just planning around an inheritance. That sounds like he's got something specific in mind. Something with a timeline." I hadn't let myself follow that thought all the way to its edge. Not yet, not until my son said it out loud in the cold garage air, and gave it a shape I could no longer avoid looking at directly. I thought of the fabricated urgency behind the 72-hour scramble to gut the guest room before the review period had even concluded. I thought of Craig's confidence, a man who had been between real estate deals for 4 months, yet still carried himself like someone with a plan already moving beneath the surface of his days. "Gordon needs to hear this," I said. We drove downtown together the next morning, the two of us in Marcus's rental car, and sat across from Gordon Pierce in his office on the 14th floor. The same office where Eleanor and I had signed the original trust documents 11 years earlier, back when this all still felt like a formality, an act of caution rather than necessity. Gordon listened the way he always did, without interrupting, his pen moving steadily across a legal pad, and when I finished recounting the conversation through the garage wall, he set the pen down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, somewhere between concern and grim satisfaction. "Walter," he said, "I need to tell you something I've been sitting on for 4 days, because I wanted to verify it before I brought it to you." He opened a folder on his desk, the kind of folder I had come to recognize over 11 days as a container for things that would hurt before they helped. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a title search on the Hale property, dated 3 weeks earlier. "Someone requested a full title and lien search on this address 3 weeks ago," Gordon said. "Not through my office. through an independent title company downtown. The request came from an account registered to Craig Cole. Marcus swore under his breath. I sat very still, the way I had stood still on the other side of that garage wall, letting the shape of it settle. That's not illegal, Gordon continued carefully, and I want to be precise about that, because precision matters here. Title searches are public information, available to anyone, but it tells us something important. Craig wasn't simply speculating about your property on a phone call. He was actively preparing to move on it, gathering the documentation someone would need before listing a property or securing financing against it. He's been building toward something concrete. Toward what? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the shape of the answer. Gordon slid a second document across the desk, this one a printout of a real estate listing platform's internal draft page, the kind agents use before a property officially goes public. My address was on it, a projected listing price, a projected closing timeline. The listing agent field carried Craig's professional license number. He's already built the listing, Gordon said quietly. It's not live, it's saved as a draft. But it exists, Walter. And it exists on a house he does not own, has never owned, and has no legal standing to sell. I looked at that draft listing for a long time, my house reduced to a projected price and a projected closing date. The home Eleanor and I had built our whole life inside of treated like inventory, waiting for the right moment to move. Something in my chest that had been aching dully for 11 days sharpened suddenly into something closer to clarity than pain. Vanessa doesn't know, I said. It wasn't a question. I already believed it. The same way I'd believed it standing frozen on the other side of that garage wall, and Marcus, beside me, nodded slowly in agreement. She might not, Gordon said. But I want you to understand something before we go further, Walter, because I think it matters to how you handle what comes next. Whether or not Vanessa knows, the trust protects this property completely. Craig has no legal authority to sell it, list it, or borrow against it under any circumstance. Nothing he's done so far constitutes an actual crime, not yet. Preparing a draft listing on a property you don't have clear title to is reckless, and it's certainly a serious breach of professional ethics for a licensed agent. But the moment it becomes criminal is the moment he takes an action to actually execute it, forges a signature, misrepresents ownership to a buyer or a lender, falsifies a document. So we wait, Marcus said. So we watch. Gordon corrected gently. There's a difference. And Walter, there's something else I found in the course of this review that I think you need to see, and I want you sitting down when I show it to you. He glanced at me. You already are. Good. He opened a second folder, thinner than the first, and slid across a single photocopied page, a standard capacity evaluation referral form from a local geriatric care practice, dated 9 days earlier, the same week the guest room notice had been delivered. The referring physician's name at the top was one I had never heard before. The section for patient history had been filled in with details that were, on their surface, plausible. A vague account of memory lapses, disorientation, difficulty managing finances. My name was on the form. My signature was not, but a signature had been provided regardless. In the box marked patient consent, a shaky approximation of my handwriting that someone had clearly tried and failed to make convincing. This came through a routine records request from your primary care office, Gordon said. Someone attempted to initiate a capacity evaluation referral in your name using a forged consent signature, roughly the same week the occupancy notice was delivered. I stared at that shaky signature for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my stomach that had nothing to do with the garage's temperature. 63 years old, and someone in my own family had tried to quietly open the door toward having me declared incompetent, using a signature that wasn't mine before I'd even had time to properly grieve the loss of my bedroom. Craig, Marcus said, his voice tight. We don't know that for certain yet, Gordon said, though his tone suggested he suspected exactly the same thing. But we will. I've already flagged the request with the practice's compliance office, and forged medical consent is a matter they're required to investigate formally, separate from anything happening in this house. That investigation is now moving on its own timeline, outside of our control and outside of Craig's. I sat in that office for a long while after Gordon finished laying out what he'd found. My son beside me, the ache in my chest no longer dull but sharp and specific, focused now on a single shaking signature that wasn't mine, forged by someone who apparently believed that having me declared incompetent was simply one more logistical step on the way to closing a deal on a house I had built with my own toes hands. "What do we do?" I finally asked. Gordon leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "We do what you've been doing since the day that suitcase showed up packed by someone else's hands," he said. "We let the mechanism work exactly the way it was designed to. Nothing rushed. Nothing punitive beyond what the facts themselves require. You already have a full neuropsychological evaluation on record from 18 months ago, requested proactively, showing full capacity, no cognitive concerns whatsoever. That evaluation alone is enough to make this forged referral collapse the moment any one official looks at it seriously. In the meantime, I want you to do one thing, and I want you to do it exactly as I describe it." "Tell me," I said. "Go home," Gordon said. "Continue sleeping in that garage, painful as that is, for a little while longer. Say nothing to Vanessa or Craig about anything we've discussed today. Let them believe the 72-hour review is the full extent of what's happening. And Walter, I want you to make absolutely certain that alarm monitoring account of yours stays exactly where it is, under your name, active, untouched. Don't let anyone talk you into transferring it, not even as a gesture of goodwill. That account is about to matter more than either of us fully understands yet." I didn't understand, not completely. Not that afternoon in Gordon's office with Marcus's hand resting on my shoulder, and a forged signature sitting on the desk between us. But I trusted Gordon Pierce the way I had trusted him for 26 years, and so I nodded. And I told him I would wait, and I meant it. We drove home in silence for most of the way, Marcus's hand steady on the wheel, the Denver skyline shrinking behind us in the rearview mirror. It was Marcus who finally spoke. Somewhere past the last exit before our neighborhood, his voice quiet in the way that meant he'd been turning something over for a while before deciding to say it out loud. "Dad," he said, "when this is over, however it ends up ending, I don't think it can just go back to what it was before. Even if Vanessa comes back to herself. Even if this whole thing with Craig falls apart the way it should." "I know," I said, and I found, surprising myself slightly, that I did know it. Had known it for days now, somewhere underneath the grief and the cold nights on Ray Delgado's borrowed cot. Some locks, once they're forced, you can repair the mechanism, but the door never sits in the frame quite the same way again. You just learn to live with the small gap, and you make sure it still locks. Marcus glanced at me, something in his expression softening. "That another one of your locksmith sayings? Your mother used to say I had too many of those," I said, and for the first time in 11 days I felt something close to a real smile settle onto my face. Small and tired but genuine. She wasn't wrong. We pulled into the driveway just as the porch light flicked on, Vanessa's silhouette briefly visible in the kitchen window, moving between the counter and the sink the way she had 1,000 evenings before all of this began. And for a moment, watching her through the glass, I let myself hold two truths at once, the way I had learned to over 11 long days. That my daughter had, somewhere inside her, tried to comfort me with a tin of handwritten recipes, and that her husband had, in that same stretch of days, drafted a listing for my house and forged my signature onto a document meant to strip me of my own mind. Both things were true. I would need to hold both of them steady in my hands, the way you hold two keys on the same ring, if I was going to make it through whatever was still coming. I didn't yet know that the coming would arrive in exactly 8 days. At a housewarming party, Vanessa was already planning for the newly finished studio, the same party where Craig intended, though I couldn't have known this yet either, to finally move his draft listing from private folder into public reality. I only knew, standing in the driveway with my son beside me, and the porch light glowing warm and false through the kitchen window, that the quiet part of this story was ending, and that whatever came next would not be quiet at all. 8 days folded into each other the way days do when you're waiting for something you can feel coming but can't yet see the shape of. I kept sleeping in the garage. I kept saying nothing to Vanessa or Craig about the title search. The draft listing, the forged signature sitting in Gordon's locked file cabinet downtown. Some mornings that silence felt like the hardest work I'd done in years, harder than any lock I'd ever cut. Because it meant sitting across the kitchen table from my daughter while she talked about paint samples for the studio, nodding along, giving nothing away. Vanessa mentioned the housewarming 3 separate times that week, growing more animated with each mention. She wanted to unveil the finished studio properly, she said. Invite the neighbors, invite her small circle of followers who'd been asking about the renovation for months, maybe even do a short video walkthrough for her page. Craig, for his part, seemed unusually invested in the guest list, and it was Ray Delgado who first noticed why. He's inviting half the real estate board, Ray told me, leaning against my workbench on the Wednesday before the party, having stopped by under the pretense of borrowing a torque wrench he clearly didn't need. I ran into him at the hardware store, picking up extra folding chairs. He mentioned some investors he wanted to introduce to Vanessa, called it networking. I understood then, with a clarity that settled cold and certain into my chest, exactly what Craig intended to use that party for. Not simply a celebration of tile and paint, a stage, a room full of people with capital and connections, gathered under the pretense of admiring a yoga studio, while somewhere in the background a draft listing waited to become real the moment the right conversation landed in the right ear. I called Gordon that evening. He's going to use the party, I said. Turn it into a soft launch. Get investors talking about the property before Vanessa even knows what's on the table. Gordon was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and when he spoke, there was something new in his voice, a kind of settled resolve I hadn't heard from him in the 11 days since this whole ordeal began. Then that's exactly where this needs to end, Walter, he said. Not privately, in a lawyer's office, weeks from now. There, in front of the people he's trying to use as leverage. But we do this carefully, we do this correctly. I want to be very clear with you about what you can and cannot say in that room, because the moment you cross into disclosing something that hasn't been formally verified, you hand him exactly the narrative he wants, an unstable old man making wild accusations at a party. Tell me what I can say, I said. You can state, factually and without elaboration, that the property is held in an irrevocable family trust and is not, and has never been, available for sale, Gordon said. You can state that any listing activity involving this address was undertaken without the trust's knowledge or authorization. Those are simple, verifiable facts, and they will land like a dropped anvil in a room full of real estate professionals who understand exactly what they mean. What you cannot do, not yet, is bring up the forged consent form. That matter is still under formal investigation by the Medical Practices Compliance Office, and going public with it before that process concludes could compromise it entirely, maybe even give Craig grounds to claim the whole thing is fabricated retaliation. Save that. Confront him with it privately before the party if you want him rattled walking into that room, but it does not go on public display. I understood, and I told him so, and I hung up the phone with a plan finally taking a shape I could hold on to. I confronted Craig 2 nights before the party, catching him alone in the driveway as he unloaded folding chairs from his truck. I didn't raise my voice. I have found, across 63 years, that the quietest sentence in a room is usually the one that does the most damage, because it forces the other person to lean in close enough to feel exactly how steady you are. I know about the draft listing, I said, and I know about the capacity referral with my name signed onto it in handwriting that isn't mine. Craig went very still, a stack of folding chairs balanced against his hip, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, the kind of silence that confirms more than any denial could have. Then, because men like Craig rarely know how to simply stop when they're caught, he tried anyway. That's not what it looks like, he said. I've spent 31 years reading what things actually are underneath what they look like, I said. It's the whole trade, Craig. You don't get to tell me what a lock is when I'm the one who cut it. I let that sit for a moment before I continued. Here is what's going to happen. You're going to take down that draft listing tonight. And 2 nights from now, at that party you and my daughter are hosting, you are going to stand there and let the truth about this property be said out loud in front of every investor you invited. Because if you don't, the version of this that comes out publicly won't be a quiet correction at a party. It'll be a formal referral to your licensing board and a police report for forgery, and neither of those things happen quietly. He didn't answer me. He picked up the folding chairs and carried them into the garage past where I stood, brushing close enough that I could see, for just a moment, something crack open behind his composed expression, not quite fear, but close enough to it that I recognized the shape. It should have ended there. I want you to understand that I believed, walking back into the house that night, that I had given Craig every reasonable off-ramp a desperate man could ask for. I was wrong. He came for the ledger at midnight, 2 nights later. The night before the party, I woke to the faint sound of the side garage door, the one that led in from the yard rather than the driveway, easing open on hinges I had oiled myself only a month earlier, quiet enough that most people wouldn't have noticed. I am not most people. I have spent 31 years listening to the particular sound a door makes when someone is trying very hard not to be heard opening it, and that sound pulled me up off the cot before my mind had even fully caught up to my body. I saw him by the dim glow of his phone flashlight, crouched at the workbench cabinet where the ledger lived, its brass corner guard catching a thin line of light as he lifted it out. Craig, still in the clothes he'd worn to dinner, moving with the careful, hurried precision of a man who believed he had one narrow window to make a problem disappear before morning. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. "Put it down, Craig," I said from the darkness near the cot, and I watched him flinch so violently that his phone clattered against the concrete floor. What he didn't know, what I hadn't fully understood myself until Gordon explained it to me weeks earlier, was that the side garage door was wired directly into the monitoring system I had installed and never transferred out of my own name, and that any unscheduled entry after 11 at night triggered a silent alert straight to the monitoring company's dispatch line, the same protocol I'd built into 100 other homes across 3 states, the same protocol I had simply never bothered to update once Vanessa and Craig moved in, because nobody had ever asked me to. I didn't know it yet, standing in the dark with my heart hammering and my son-in-law frozen mid-crouch by my workbench, but somewhere across the city a dispatcher was already reading my address off a screen, confirming an unscheduled after-hours breach at a residence with an active monitoring contract, and a patrol unit was already pulling out of a nearby station lot. "Give me the ledger," I said, "and get out of my garage." Craig straightened slowly, the leather book clutched against his chest the way I had clutched it myself 11 nights earlier. Standing in this same room after the suitcase, after the 72-hour notice, after everything that had led us both to this frozen moment at midnight. "You don't understand," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of its usual polish, cracked open now into something raw and cornered. "If this gets out before the party, everything I've built collapses. The listing, the investors, all of it. Nothing you built was ever yours to build," I said. "That's the part you never understood, Craig. Not once in 4 years." Headlights swept briefly across the garage's small side window, silent and blue-edged, and Craig's head snapped toward the sound of a car door closing softly in the driveway. I saw the exact moment understanding landed in his face, the color leaving it in a single visible wave. "Is that?" he started. "That's the police," I said, and I felt, standing there in the dark with the ledger's fate hanging between us, something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not quite, but a kind of settled clarity, the particular peace of a man watching a mechanism he built decades ago finally do exactly what it was designed to do, protecting a house that had, in its own quiet electrical way, remembered me after all. The officers were courteous and thorough, the way officers tend to be when a call comes in as a straightforward breach on a monitored residence. I confirmed my identity as the account holder. I confirmed Craig's identity as a resident of the home, which meant no arrest that night, no charges filed on the spot, only a report carefully documented, noting an unscheduled after-hours entry, my statement about the attempted removal of personal property from a locked cabinet, and Craig stammered, incomplete explanation about looking for a missing set of car keys, an explanation that satisfied no one standing in that garage, least of all the officer writing it down. Vanessa came out in her robe partway through, drawn by the light sweeping across the bedroom window, and I watched her face as she took in the scene. Her husband, standing pale and cornered beside a police officer at nearly 1 in the morning, and something in her expression told me that whatever fragile trust she'd been extending to him for the past several weeks had just taken a blow it would not easily recover from. She didn't ask me anything that night. She simply stood in the driveway in her robe, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, watching the patrol car's lights fade back toward the street. And when I finally went back to the cot an hour later, I lay awake for a long time listening to the low murmur of her and Craig's voices through the thin garage wall, unable to make out the words, but able to hear clearly enough that for the first time in a long while, my daughter was the one asking the questions. The party happened anyway the following evening because Vanessa had already invited 40 people and refused, even now, to cancel it outright. I understood that impulse better than I let on. Some habits, once a life has been built around them, are hard to set down even after the ground beneath them has cracked. The studio looked exactly as advertised, soft lighting, a diffuser filling the air with something floral, the yoga mats stacked neatly against a wall that used to hold my dresser. I stood near the back of the crowded living room in a clean shirt Marcus had ironed for me that afternoon, watching investors and neighbors mingle with glasses of wine, watching Craig work the room with the practiced ease of a man determined to salvage something from a night that had already, in every way that mattered, slipped out of his control. It was Marcus who moved first. Craig had gathered a small cluster of guests near the studio's new bay window, gesturing toward the backyard, saying something about lot size and future potential that made my stomach turn cold even before I fully caught the words. My son crossed the room before I could stop him, stepping directly into the circle of investors with the same unhurried confidence his mother used to carry into any room she walked into. "Before this goes any further," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly over the low-party chatter, "I think everyone here should know that this property is held in an irrevocable family trust. It has never been for sale, and it is not for sale now. Any listing activity involving this address was undertaken without the trust's knowledge or authorization." He turned deliberately to look at Craig. "Isn't that right?" The room went quiet the way a room does when a single sentence lands wrong in the middle of polite conversation. No dramatic gasp, just a sudden stillness, glasses pausing halfway to lips. The soft hum of the diffuser somehow audible now in a way it hadn't been a moment earlier. I watched Craig's jaw work, watched him search for a version of the truth he could survive, saying out loud and find none. It was Vanessa who spoke next, and it was her voice, not mine, not Marcus's, that finally broke the silence wide open. "Is that true?" she said, stepping toward her husband, her voice shaking but clear enough to carry across the room. "The listing." Marcus said listing, Craig. "What listing?" Craig didn't answer fast enough. That silence, more than anything Marcus or I could have said, told the room everything it needed to know. "I found a draft," Vanessa said, and I realized with a jolt that she must have gone looking herself sometime in the last day, unable to shake whatever suspicion the midnight police visit had planted in her. "On your laptop. 2 nights ago. I thought I was imagining it. You told me it was an old template you never used." Her voice cracked, rising now, no longer shaking but sharpening into something I hadn't heard from my daughter in years. Not since she was a teenager standing up for herself against a teacher who'd underestimated her. "You were going to sell my father's house. Behind both our backs, Vanessa," Craig started. "Don't," she said, and the single word landed with more force than anything he could have said in his own defense. She turned to face the room. 40 guests, investors, neighbors, all of them frozen mid-conversation, wine glasses forgotten in their hands, and something in my chest broke open, watching my daughter find, in that exact moment, the courage I had been quietly hoping she still had buried somewhere beneath 4 years of somebody else's ambition. "My father built this house's locks with his own hands," she said, her voice unsteady but growing stronger with each word. "He built the alarm system. He paid for the renovations when the foundation cracked. And 2 weeks ago, I told him to sleep in the garage so I could put a yoga studio where his bedroom used to be, and I let my husband tell me it was just logistics. Her eyes found mine across the room, wet and open in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know when I stopped seeing what you'd actually given us. I want to tell you that I crossed that room immediately and folded my daughter into my arms in front of everyone, that the whole thing resolved itself cleanly in that single dramatic moment, the way these stories sometimes promise you they will. It didn't happen quite that way, and I think that's important because real reconciliation rarely arrives all at once. What happened instead was smaller and more honest. I nodded to her once across the crowded room, and she nodded back. And something passed between us that didn't need an audience to be real. The party dissolved quickly after that, investors making quiet excuses, neighbors slipping out with the particular haste of people who've witnessed something they'll be discussing for weeks. Craig left sometime before midnight, packing a bag with none of the careful folding that had gone into mine 3 weeks earlier, and I have not seen him since. Though Gordon tells me the licensing board investigation is proceeding, along with the forged consent matter, both moving now on their own separate, unstoppable timelines, exactly the way Gordon had promised they would. What I remember most clearly from that night isn't the confrontation itself, but what happened an hour later, once the house had emptied out and it was just Vanessa, Marcus, Lily asleep upstairs, and me, sitting together in the kitchen for the first time in weeks, as I went out to the garage and brought back the ledger. I hadn't opened the taped compartment in the back cover in 3 years, as not since the week after Eleanor died, when I'd sealed it shut because I couldn't bear to look at what was inside without her sitting across from me. I opened it now, at the kitchen table with my son on one side and my daughter on the other, and I took out a folded letter in Eleanor's handwriting, written the year Vanessa was born, tucked away with the brass master key from the day we opened the shop together, engraved simply W&E, first key, 1985. I read the letter aloud. It wasn't long and it wasn't dramatic. Eleanor had written it worried, in her own words, that our children would grow up mistaking the comfort we'd built for something owed to them rather than something given, and she'd asked, gently, that whoever eventually read it remember to teach them the difference between being loved and being provided for. She hadn't predicted Craig, or the studio, or any of the specific shape this trouble had taken. She'd simply understood, decades before any of it happened, the general shape of what love curdles into when nobody stops to name it. Vanessa cried, reading it over my shoulder, quietly, without performance, and when she finished, she took my hand across the table the way she used to when she was very young, and said the thing I hadn't realized I'd been waiting 3 weeks to hear. I want to earn my way back into being the daughter you can trust, she said. Not because you're making me, because I want to. You don't have to earn anything, I said. And then, because honesty had carried me this far, and I saw no reason to stop now, I added the harder truth I'd been sitting with since the night I first heard Craig's voice through the garage wall. I should have said something the first time I noticed how quiet you'd gotten around him. Years ago, I let my own grief make me smaller in this house than I should have been, and I think that gave the silence more room to grow than it should have had. That's on me too, Vanessa. Not just on you. She didn't have an answer for that. Not right away, but she squeezed my hand tighter, and that was answer enough. The following week, word had apparently traveled through the small, tight circle of the trade, because on a Saturday morning 11 of my old apprentices showed up in the driveway, unannounced, trucks and toolboxes in tow, having heard through Ray Delgado exactly what had happened. Nobody made speeches. They simply spent the day rebuilding the guest room properly, quietly, the way tradesmen do, restoring it not as a studio but as a room, again my room, with new paint and a bed frame one of them had built himself out of reclaimed oak. I stood in the driveway watching a dozen men I had trained over 3 decades' work in easy silence on my behalf, asking nothing in return, and understood, watching them, that a life spent teaching people to build things carefully eventually comes back around to find you in exactly the moment you need it most. I moved back into that room 2 nights later. Vanessa helped me carry the last box up the stairs herself, and before she left, she paused in the doorway, the way she'd stood in that same doorway 3 weeks earlier, telling me the garage was warmer than I gave it credit for. "Does the room feel like yours again?" she asked. I looked around at the fresh paint, the new bed frame, the small window facing the side yard where the light still fell the same way it always had. "It's starting to," I said. That night, I sat at the small desk by the window and wrote Vanessa a letter of my own. Nothing formal, nothing legal, just a father's words on a single sheet of paper, wrapped around the brass master key from 1985, the one Eleanor and I had cut together the day we opened our first shop. I told her that a key only means something once someone trusts you enough to hand it over, and that I was handing this one to her now, not because the house needed a new lock, but because I wanted her to have something of her mother's and mine that had survived every version of this family we'd been, the good years and the hard ones both. I gave it to her the next morning, over coffee, and she held it in her palm for a long moment before closing her fingers around it, and neither of us needed to say very much else. Some things, once they're finally said, don't need repeating. Looking back now, I won't pretend I handled every part of this well. I let grief make me quiet in my own house for longer than I should have. I let my daughter's distance go unquestioned for years, telling myself it was simply the natural drift of a grown child building her own life, when some part of me must have known it was something more troubling than that. I share that with you not to excuse anything, but because I think the lesson underneath this whole story isn't really about locks or trusts or midnight police visits. It's about paying attention early, before the silence in your own house has time to calcify into something that looks from a distance like peace. If someone you love has gone quiet in a way that doesn't sit right with you, don't wait the way I did. Say something while the door is still easy to open. Dignity in a family isn't something you protect by staying silent and hoping it resolves itself. It's something you protect by speaking plainly, early, before somebody else gets the chance to convince the people you love that your silence meant you didn't notice or didn't care. I believe, after everything, that love doesn't get erased by 4 bad years. It gets buried, sometimes, under other people's ambitions and our own unspoken grief, but it doesn't disappear. It waits, the way a well-cut key waits in a drawer for someone to finally remember which door it opens. This is a story about a father who built the locks on every door in his own house, and still, for a little while, found himself standing on the wrong side of one of them. But a good lock, built right, always finds its way back to working the way it was meant to. So, does a family, if the people inside it are willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of fixing what got bent out of shape? If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you, truly, for staying with me until the very last word. A note before you go. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and storytelling. If that isn't what you're looking for tonight, that's completely all right. I'll be here whenever you're ready.